Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. This is the morning for us. I'm excited to be presenting some of the work I've been doing in my group here at Virginia Tech. And so in particular today, I'm going to talk about ways to improve the performance of synthetic enzymes with a DNA scaffold. So if you think a little bit more about what we know about enzyme machinery today, it fits within what we call the electrostatic enzyme catalysis picture, which is based on what the electrostatic pro-organization theory advanced by Warshall in the 1990s is about. And so if you think about this and you think about kind of a regular chemical reaction, kind of any type of chemical reaction that could be catalyzed by an enzyme, you're going to use transition state theory to compute, for example, the energy barrier between the transition state and the reactant state. And this energy barrier is going to give you effectively the catalytic rate of that reactions. So if you think now about that substrate, for example, in an environment, so here we have a reaction dipole in red that is kind of surrounded by a bunch of environmental molecules. And these can be solvent molecules, or in this case of an enzyme with a protein, it can be protein residues, right? And so all of these molecular dipoles will align to stabilize that reaction dipole that you have in a reactant state. And you have a similar kind of picture here. And so this is what we call the electrostatic picture of kind of chemical reactivity in the condensed phase. And so each of these dipole will have effectively will emit an electric field, right? The combined effect of all of these molecular, the blue dipoles will generate an electric field that would stabilize that dipole at that location. And so by comparing effectively the orientation and the magnitude of that overall electric field with respect to this dipole, you can extract how stabilized it is in the transition state versus the reactant state. And so within this electrostatic picture, what enzymes are doing is that it stabilizes the transition state by generating an electric field that is stronger in the transition state versus the reactant state. So you can see that kind of dark blue arrow here that's just stronger. And so you have a decrease in energy of the transition state due to these molecular dipole that the enzyme contributes. And so the residues that contribute to these this electrostatic stabilization of the transition states can be kind of anywhere in the protein, right? So a lot of the time they will be active site residues like the one that is showing now on the slide, as well as residues that are a little bit further away, including all the way to the protein surface. So it really is the residues throughout the entire protein sequence that can contribute to electrostatic catalysis. And so that's both a good thing and a bad thing when you think about improving the performance of enzyme. And so in particular, I focus here on synthetic enzyme because synthetic enzyme have poor performance, and that's probably the ones that you would want to improve the performance of. But so it's a good thing because that means that you're not restricted in inventing like mutations in the active site. You can think about any kind of residues that would contribute to the electrostatic pro-organization. The bad thing is that then your sequence space for improvements is much higher, and then you're risking to disrupt the overall stability of the enzyme a lot more than if you were looking at a more narrow range in the active site. And so that goes into the second kind of property of enzyme that's important to think of when it comes to improving performances. In that proteins are very flexible macromolecules, right? So whether these blue residues that I was showing before or others like here that I show in yellow are contributing to the electrostatic catalysis or not, a lot of them will be flexible residues. Right, so they will be moving on different timescales, usually from picoseconds to nanoseconds, and they contribute to the function of the proteins in different ways. A number of reasons have been advanced for why structural dynamics were important for protein catalysis. One of them would be substrate binding and product, right? So when you think about the entire catalytic cycle, or electrostatic catalysis picture really focused on that K2 chemical reaction step on the top right of that cycle. But the structural dynamics would appear to be important for the other steps of that catalytic cycle, for the substrate binding and the product release. It's also important for molecular recognition if you have multiple substrate to have the substrate for which the enzyme is optimized for to be selected. And somewhat related, it's been advanced that it's important for catalytic promiscuity and evolution of enzymes. And so what that means is that structural dynamics are very well maintained. It's a property that evolved with all of the enzyme and you can't just get rid of it. And if you propose the mutations that disrupt the structural dynamics, then you end up with an enzyme that's less performant on the catalytic step. And so it's an intricate balance between the structure and the dynamics. And that's one of the reasons why kind of improving mutation by mutation enzyme is difficult. And so we use a different kind of strategy to avoid kind of having to deal with these dynamic residues that you need to maintain, or even identifying which residues within the scaffold you would need to improve. We use a different strategy to improve the efficiency of synthetic enzyme. And so for that, we use DNA. So the goal is still within the electrostatic picture, right? If you think about the first slide I showed with this stabilization of the transition state, there's nothing that tells you that it has to come from the protein itself. And so electrostatic interactions are very long range. And so you can imagine something in the environment beyond the protein structure itself that would induce electrostatic interaction in the active site that would catalyze the reaction further. And so that's what we're trying to do here with DNA. And the reason for picking DNA is twofold. So first of all, when you think about the application to a specific enzyme, for example, K15 here, you can think about, so I think I have the reaction here. So you can think about this contamination reaction. You have three active bonds, what I call, that are breaking and forming during the reaction. And so when you're thinking about catalyzing that, you need electric fields that would stabilize the breaking and formation of all of these bonds. And so DNA in the environment, by the ability to placing all around the proteins, potentially you can target all of these bonds individually. And then DNA is a very polar molecule, of course, and so it will induce strong electrostatic interactions, and it has high programmability due to the base pair interactions. It's also very used in terms of DNA origamis and conjugation to proteins. So we already know the part of how to attach the DNA to proteins. We know how to do that. We know that it doesn't disrupt the protein structure itself. And so what we're doing here is trying to see if we can use these properties and increase the catalytic activity of the enzyme itself. And so with this, so we use modeling approaches. And so there's kind of a couple of different approaches for modeling catalysis, I guess, catalytic effect in enzyme. When you focus on the active site only, you can look at quantum or QMMM methods, right? Because it has the chemical reactivity information, but it's going to lack this statistical information that you need for the structural dynamics, right? So you get the enthalpic interaction that stabilize the transition state, but you don't get any of the rest of the statistical mechanics part. If you do molecular dynamics, usually you get that statistical mechanics information, but you lack kind of structural functional information on how it breaks bonds or form bonds. And so in particular, in this case, where we have to go long range, where the scaffold, as well as here, our DNA scaffold, right? The scaffold here means the DNA scaffold around the protein itself, support the reaction in the active site. And so what we do in my group is that we develop tools that can access this functional information from molecular dynamic simulation. And so this is particularly important here for that case on designing DNA scaffold for synthetic enzyme. So we do that using electric field calculations. So that goes back into electrostatic picture where we directly calculate the magnitude and orientation of the electric fields with respect to the dipoles that we're looking at breaking or forming. And so we do that with molecular dynamics with the amoeba polarizable force field. So a little bit more on just electric field quickly. So if you have a conformation, this is an hypothetical conformation of a protein. So for example, protein residues or water molecules, and you want to break a bond. So you know the direction of electron motion to break or form that bond. You can compute the electric fields that comes from all of these protein residues and water molecules and compare as you change conformations throughout your MD trajectory and follow the magnitude and orientation of this field with respect to the dipole here. And then more importantly, you can split these electric fields into system components, right? So you can know directly which part of the protein or the DNA contributes these electric fields. So you can really identify the part of your protein that contribute that effect, which is very important for protein design. So we created and published a code electric to do that readily as a post-processing step of MD trajectory. So here what we're trying to do is find ways to improve the catalytic performance of a specific enzyme Ki-15 with DNA. So we have a demonstration of principle here where we have the same DNA fragments, but we put it in different locations. And you can see here it's between 20 to 40 angstroms around the active site. And so we compute the effect these DNA will have independently on the activation energy. And so here we compare the reaction stabilization of the transition state compared to the enzyme without DNA. And to do that, we compute how the electric fields align with the transition state compared to the reactant state for all of the active bonds that we look at. So these are like the 3 bonds that I showed breaking and forming in that reaction. And each of the electric fields are calculated as the average of the electric fields on the 2 atoms that form the bond that you're looking at projected onto the unitary bond vector. And then because we use amoeba trajectory, that means that the electric field we compute are of 2 terms. We have a permanent electrostatic and induced electrostatic components. So we really understand how the environment kind of contribute to the electric fields in the active site. So when we do that, we can, using electric here, decompose our signal. So this is the projected electric fields in the transition state, right, as a function of residue number. So on the y-axis, you have projected electric field in megavolt per centimeter, and the x-axis, you have residues numbers. So you can really identify the strong signal with the strong peak that correspond at which part. And so in particular, you have the DNA at the end here. And so you can identify which DNA bases, for example, or which part of the DNA contribute the most. So this really helps you to understand kind of which part of the protein respond the most or interact the most with that DNA when it's there. But if you're thinking about kind of your catalytic effects, overall, we want that delta G, right? The projected electric fields is only part of the answer. It has to be combined to the magnitude of that dipole and how it orients with respect to that dipole. And so for this, we calculate that transition state stabilization energy. So here I just put the formula back just as a reminder. So we sum over all of the 3 active bonds that we have. And so what I showed in the previous slide was the projected electric field in transition state, this term. And so we compare it to the electric fields in the reactant state after we projected it on the bond dipoles for both states. And so here is effectively what we have for comparison. So we have the system or references the enzyme without DNA fragment at all. And so we have the contribution of the catalytic base in the active site, the rest of the active site, the rest of the scaffold, the DNA and the solvent for a total delta G of minus 5.7 kcal per mole. And then we can go and we looked at our 4 different positions of the DNA, DN1, 2, 3, and 4. And we can see what changes effectively when we introduce that DNA. And so there's a couple of observations that we can make. So depending on the position, of course, the DNA contributes more or less to the stabilization of the reorganization energy. And you can see here that DNA 1 and 4, for example, do stabilize the transition state, while DNA 3 and 2 actually destabilize the transition state with respect to the reactant state. So this is the kind of information we need to kind of optimize our DNA placement. But then you can also see that a lot of the effect of the DNA is not direct, but it's indirect insofar that it enhances the signal that comes from other residues. So the most important here would be the catalytic base that is in the active site, right? But the presence of the DNA really enhances the signal from that catalytic base. And so it promotes catalytic activity indirectly by helping the catalytic base support the reaction in the active site. So if you look at here, we've selected one position, for example, of the DNA here that would lead to higher catalytic gain by over 2 kcal/mol. So this is just kind of a demonstration of principle, right? We just have 4 identical DNA fragments that we put in different random position. Now we've proved that it could work. And so we're working into collaborating with experimentalists to actually create this system in practice, and to, for example, bring the DNA fragment a little bit closer so that we have control over the structure and the placement of this DNA. So this is, I guess, future work that we're starting just now. So in conclusions, we have electric fields. So they're manifestation of quantum effects right at the classical scale, so that you can link structure to function with classical molecular dynamics without having the need to do DFT calculations or QMMM calculations. You can just calculate electric fields and it gives you chemical reactivity type of informations. Electric fields can be resolved at the molecular scales, which is great in terms of catalyst design, because you can really pinpoint which particular molecule or molecular fragment in your system contribute the most to the effect you're looking at. And then finally, in this picture with the DNA, we can see that the introduction of the DNA fragments can reduce the energy barrier by up to 2 kcal/mol. And so these were kind of randomly placed around and the sequence was not optimized. And so that would suggest that even more significant catalytic improvement could be made by optimizing the DNA size, the sequence, and the orientation kind of with respect to the enzyme. And so with that, I would acknowledge my group. So this work that I've talked about today is primarily from my graduate student, Yi Deng, over here. And I thank the rest of my group for support and funding here, including the ICTAS Faculty Award that is funding this specific project. And thank